טוב. בוקר טוב לכולם. אני אודה לכולם על סגירה של פלאפונים. אנחנו רוצים להתחיל. ואני מזמינה את דוקטור שמש, סגן מנהל בית החולים, לפתוח את הכינוס.
בוקר טוב לכולם. האמת היא שמופיע בתוכנית שפרופסור הלוי צריך לדבר, אבל היום בתי החולים חלק משמעותי מהתקציב שלהם מגיע בתרומות, ואחד התפקידים החשובים של מנהל בית חולים זה לשוטט בעולם ולהביא תרומות. ולכן הוא ביקש להביע את התנצלותו שלא יוכל להגיע, ואני התחליף, זה מה יש. א', אני רוצה לברך את כל באי הכנס. הנושא הזה הוא נושא טעון אמוציונלית בצורה קיצונית שאנחנו נתקלים בו במשפחה שמאבדת את הילד ללא סיבה ברורה, ומדי פעם, בייחוד בחדרי המיון, ילדים רואים את המקרים הללו ואת הצער והכאב העצום שיש למשפחות האלה, ובאמת הרפואה ככל יכולתה צריכה לעשות מה שאפשר לעשות בנושא הזה, ואני חושב שכל כנס תורם לדברים הללו. חינוך ולאחר הגדרת גורמי הסיכון, ואני מניח שזה חלק מהדברים שאתם תעסקו בהם. אז א', אני רוצה לברך את דוקטור שץ באמת שארגנה את הכנס וטרחה קשות, ויש לה את העמותה שלה, ובזכותה דברים כאלה מתקדמים יפה עם כל המתנדבים שנמצאים. ודבר נוסף, אני רוצה לספר לכם טיפה על שערי צדק. שערי צדק זה בית חולים שנוסד ב-1902. היום הוא כבר כמעט 110 שנים, על ידי יהודים מגרמניה והולנד שהחליטו להקים בית חולים. הוא ישב בכניסה בשער יפו, מי שזוכר איפה זה, ובשנת 78 הוא עבר לכאן, ובית החולים הזה הולך וגדל בצורה אקספוננציאלית בכל השנים הללו. רק לסבר לכם את האוזן, זה תחום שאולי קשור אליכם. בשנות ה-90, בשנות ה-80 היו לנו 4,000 לידות. היום יש לנו סדר גודל של 14,000 לידות לשנה, מספר אחד בישראל, ועוד היד נטויה, אם אפשר לקרוא לזה יד. כמו כן, בית החולים גדל בצורה מאוד אקספוננציאלית, גם בחדרי ניתוח וכל הדברים הללו. חלק נובע מהגדילה של האוכלוסייה בירושלים, חלק נובע מהמיקום של בית החולים שנמצא יחסית במקום טוב, ועוד גורמים אחרים. בכל אופן, אנחנו מתרחבים לכל התחומים, ובאמת מעוניינים לפתח את השירות הטוב לקהל בירושלים. בכל מקרה, אני רוצה לברך את כולם, שיהיה כנס מענה ומעניין, ושיהיה לכם יום נעים. תודה.
תודה רבה. בוקר טוב לכולם. כבוד רב הוא לי לפתוח את הכנס הארצי לאנשי מקצוע בנושא של זיהוי וטיפול בגורמי סיכון למוות בעריסה. ברוכים הבאים לירושלים, וברכה מיוחדת לאורחים שלנו שבאו מניו זילנד ומארצות הברית. Special welcome to our guest speakers from the States and from New Zealand. You've come a long way to share your knowledge with us, so we really appreciate it. כיושב ראש עמותת עתיד, שהינה עמותה המושתתת על מתנדבים, הריני להודות על ההקרבה, המסירות של כל חבריה ותקצר היריעה. תודה מיוחדת לוועדה המארגנת של עתיד, עדנה הירשמן, עדינה דורמבוס, סלין מיכליס ויונה שיפמן. הכנס השנה נערך בשיתוף עם המרכז הרפואי שערי צדק, המשמש לנו אכסניה חמה. תודה לכל אנשי שערי צדק שלקחו חלק במאמץ, ותודה לדוקטור אלי פיקר, מנהל יחידת ילדים, על עזרתו. תודה והערכה מיוחדת לכל המרצים המשתתפים שהשקיעו ובלעדיהם לא היה כנס. מוות עריסה הוא גורם המוות העיקרי בין גיל חודש לגיל שנה בעולם המערבי. זהו מוות פתאומי, בלתי צפוי ובלתי מוסבר של תינוק שהיה בריא לגמרי קודם לכן, וגם בדיקה מדוקדקת שלאחר המוות, הכוללת נתיחה, חקירת זירת האירוע וההיסטוריה הרפואית של התינוק ומשפחתו, לא מצאו כל סיבה שיכולה להסביר את המוות. אז הסיבה למוות הפתאומי עדיין לא ידועה למרות מחקרים רבים. מסתמן כיוון, אך אין הוכחה. הכיוון מצביע על בעיה סמויה במערכת העצבית בגזע המוח, באזור שאחראי על התגובה למצבים מאיימי חיים בזמן שינה ועל התעוררות. הבעיה באה לידי ביטוי רק בנסיבות מסוימות, שכנראה יוצרות מצב מצוקה בזמן השינה. זוהי תופעה רפואית שאיננו יודעים מה הגורם לה, אבל מחקרים אפידמיולוגיים מקיפים בעולם זיהו גורמי סיכון. בנוכחותם של גורמי הסיכון, הסיכון להיארעות התופעה עולה מאוד באופן סטטיסטי. גורם הסיכון הראשון, אשר זוהה במחקרים אפידמיולוגיים מקבילים בניו זילנד על ידי פרופסור מיטשל ובאנגליה על ידי פרופסור פלמינג, הוא תנוחת השינה על הבטן. טיפול בגורם הסיכון התנוחתי הביא לירידה דרסטית בתמותה, בין 50 ל-70% בארצות בהן הפנימו
צופן,
ומשכיבים תינוקות על הגב בלבד.
חדר 3, קומה 2. צופן, 1-1-1. פנימיתיה, קומה 2, חדר 3. צופן, 1-1-1. פנימיתיה, קומה 2, חדר 3. צופן, 1-1-1. פנימיתיה, קומה 2, חדר 3.
אוקיי, סורי. בארצות שבהן הפנימו את ההשכבה של תינוקות על הגב לכל זמן שינה, ניכרת ירידה משמעותית בתמותה. ולמרות הירידה הדרסטית בעולם המערבי, בארץ השיעורים של מוות פתאומי לא מוסבר נשארו דומים. ואני מדברת כאן על הסל של כל הגורמים של מוות פתאומי לא מוסבר. אני רוצה להראות לכם, על פי הנתונים של הלשכה המרכזית לסטטיסטיקה, שהסך הכל, אם אנחנו מסתכלים על כל המקרים של מוות שנכללו הן על סידס והן אנון, בסך הכל אין שינוי משמעותי במשך השנים האחרונות. אבל כשאנחנו מדברים על שכיחות התופעה בארץ, איננו יודעים כלל על מה אנחנו מדברים. יש רק אומדנים, שכן הדרישה לשלול כל סיבה שתסביר את המוות הפתאומי על ידי נתיחה שלאחר המוות וחקירה דקדקנית של זירת האירוע לא מתקיימים בארצנו. בכל שנת 2009 בוצעו במכון לרפואה משפטית בישראל רק 2 נתיחות של תינוקות שנפטרו באופן פתאומי. לכן לא ניתן לקבוע שיעור מקרי מוות עריסה טהורים מתוך כלל מקרי המוות הפתאומי הבלתי מוסבר של תינוקות, מה שאנחנו קוראים sudden unexplained infant death. אבל אם לוקחים את הסל של מקרי המוות הפתאומי לתקופות שבין 97-2000, 2001-2004, 2005 ו-2009, שזה על פי הנתונים של הלשכה המרכזית לסטטיסטיקה, אנחנו למדים שהשיעור הוא כ-0.5 ל-1,000 לידות חי, 0.46, 0.6, זה נע. אבל הוא לא השתנה מבחינת מגמה. למרות שהתמותה הכללית של תינוקות בארץ ירדה בצורה משמעותית. באוכלוסייה היהודית, למשל, מ-4.7 ל-1,000 לידות חי ב-98 ל-2.7 ל-1,000 לידות חי ב-2009. באוכלוסייה הערבית הייתה ירידה פחותה בתמותה הכללית, מ-8.7 ל-7.1 ל-1,000 לידות חי באותה תקופה. אבל גם שיעורי מקרי המוות הפתאומי בתינוקות באוכלוסייה הערבית נשאר קבוע, ופי 3 לערך יותר מה שבאוכלוסייה היהודית, שוב לפי נתוני הלמ"ס. על המאפיינים של מקרי המוות הפתאומי בישראל בשנים האחרונות מ-2008 ואילך תרחיב בדבריה דוקטור ליזה רובין ממשרד הבריאות. היום נדון גם באפשרות להקטין את התמותה על ידי שינוי התנהגותי, טיפול בגורמי סיכון נוספים מעבר לגורם התנוחה שניתנים לשינוי. ביניהם עישון, חשיפת העובר והתינוק לעישון, שהפך לגורם הסיכון הראשון בחשיבותו בתינוקות ששוכבים על הגב בזמן שינה. הימנעות מהנקה, אפשר לתקן. סביבת שינה לא בטוחה, טוקסינים, אפשר לתקן. כולל שינה משותפת ופגות. מסקרים שונים שערכנו בארץ למדנו שלא קיימת מודעות מספקת לקיום כל גורמי הסיכון. אך יתרה מזאת, גם כשקיימת מודעות, אין הפנמה וביצוע בשטח של ההמלצות. מכאן עולה השאלה, איך מתגברים על החסמים בין המודעות לסיכון, לביצוע בשטח של השינוי ההתנהגותי הנדרש כדי להפחית את הסיכון. על גישה חדשה להתגבר על החסמים וביצוע המלצות, נשמע מפרופסור פרן הוק, החברה בכוח המשימה לנושא המוות בעריסה באקדמיה האמריקאית לרפואת ילדים. במושב בראשות פרופסור אסא כשר, חתן פרס ישראל לאתיקה, נבחן היבטים רפואיים, משפטיים, אתיים והלכתיים ביחס לאפשרות ולצורך לחייב נתיחה במקרי מוות פתאומי בתינוקות בישראל, כדי להגיע לאבחון מדויק. וכדי להספיק את כל הנושאים האלה, אני מתכבדת להזמין את פרופסור אד מיטשל לפתוח בהרצאתו. It is my honor, great honor, to invite you, Professor Mitchell, to the podium. Thanks again for coming all the way from New Zealand. And I'll have a few words about you, which you already know, so I'll take them. You can come. While you are walking to the podium, I'll say a few words about you in Hebrew. Don't worry. פרופסור אד מיטשל מכהן כיושב ראש החברה הבינלאומית לחקר ומניעת מוות פתאומי בתינוקות. הוא רופא ילדים שעוסק בהתפתחות הילד ומכהן כפרופסור במכון המחקר לבריאות הילד באוניברסיטת אוקלנד בניו זילנד. You understood Auckland and New Zealand. עיקר מחקריו באפידמיולוגיה של הסידס, והיה מראשוני החוקרים שזיהו גורמי סיכון למוות עריסה. ממצאיו חוללו מפנה משמעותי באפשרות להשפיע על התופעה ולשנות את השכיחות למוות בעריסה. והרי הצלת תינוקות היא מטרתנו. פרופסור אד מיטשל, please take the podium. Okay. You can just push here.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a real honor and a great privilege to be here in Jerusalem. This is such a fascinating city, and my wife and I have really enjoyed visiting the old city. Annette was recently in Auckland and spoke at our grand round, and if my talk is half as good as her, I'll have done my job. What I want to try and cover in the next 45 minutes is a little bit about risk factors, and then to say about what epidemiology might give us a clue about what the mechanisms involved with SIDS. At the end of the day, we still don't know what's causing the death of so many infants, but we do have some clues, and that's what I want to spend some time addressing. What I've listed, what I've listed here is the risk factors that I wish to talk about: sleeping positions, smoking, bed sharing. But we also need to think about head covering, and 3 factors that are protective: the use of pacifiers, breastfeeding, and room sharing. And I think that some of the other speakers today will cover the ones in white, and so I won't address those. But now, as we all know, there are numerous overwhelming evidence from case control studies that prone sleeping position is associated with SIDS, and the recommendation to place infants to sleep on their backs, the so-called Back to Sleep campaign, has been associated with a dramatic fall in SIDS mortality. And infant care surveys in a number of countries continue to show that very few babies sleep prone. And in New Zealand, over the last 20 years, each survey we've done has shown that less than 3% of babies are now sleeping prone. And so in our country, prone sleeping position isn't, as a risk factor, has largely been eliminated. However, there is one group that is a problem, and those are babies that are placed prone that are not normally placed prone. Let me just take you through this rather complex slide slowly. We can think of the usual sleeping position. So if you ask people what position they usually place the baby, you can have non-prone, and then on the last sleep, non-prone, and that's our comparative group. Some babies, when we did our study, were usually placed prone on the last sleep, and had a 4-fold increased risk of dying. But this group is very small. This is a group where they usually are placed non-prone to sleep, but on the last night, for some reason, they were placed prone. Only 1% of controls are used this, and 8% of babies dying. So it's not a huge proportion of cases, but look at the increased risk. This is about the highest odds ratio that one might see, a 19-fold increased risk. And so what we don't know from these surveys why the infants were placed prone, but it does emphasise that all carers of the babies, such as grandparents, babysitters, need to know that the preferred sleeping position is supine or on their back. Now, what about smoking? Numerous studies have shown that there is an association between smoking and sudden infant death syndrome. And there have been at least 17 studies since the Back to Sleep campaigns coming from a whole variety of different countries. And every study statistically shows a risk. And the pooled odds ratio is almost 4, an increased risk of 4. So infants of mothers who smoke are at very high rate of dying. Now, the big problem we're trying to look at whether the risk is due to pregnancy, smoking in pregnancy, or smoking postnatally, i.e. in the first few, while the baby's alive, is because the two behaviours are so common. If you smoke during pregnancy, you're likely to smoke afterwards. And so it's very difficult to try and distinguish between whether it's a problem of smoking in the womb or after birth. One way of trying to sort this out is to look at where mothers don't smoke, but they were exposed to smoking. So if you look at the risk where the father's a smoker, but the mother's a non-smoker, you find that there are about 7 studies, and the increased risk is only 1.5. It is statistically significant, but it's very much smaller. So what we can conclude from the smoking literature is that there is substantial evidence that maternal smoking in pregnancy is associated with SIDS, and as I showed you, an odds ratio of 3.9. The effect of environmental tobacco smoking is small, but statistically significant. And therefore it seems quite probable that the effect of maternal smoking is an effect in utero exposure of the fetus. Now, I don't know what the maternal smoking rate is in Israel, but in New Zealand, about 25% of mothers in pregnancy smoke. Sorry? It's very similar? They're much less, right. Okay. If we assume that the odds ratio is 3.9, in New Zealand it would suggest that 35% of SIDS cases can be attributed to smoking. Obviously in Israel, if the smoking rate is much less than 25%, that figure is also going to be less. It seems to me that what smoking does is in some way makes the baby more vulnerable. We know it reduces birth weight, and it's possible that it causes an arousal defect in the baby. Now, I just thought I ought to just outline, because I'm going to be presenting quite a bit of data from the New Zealand study. Now, the New Zealand study actually looked at 485 SIDS cases. We managed to interview 81%. We looked at the obstetric records of almost all of them, and we compared them with 1,800 controls, and 88% agreed to participate, and again, we were able to look at just about all the obstetric records. When we, the other third risk factor which I was going to talk about was co-sleeping or bed sharing. Now, in our study, on the last night, 10% of control infants were sharing the bed with their parent, and 24% of babies were found dead in bed with the parent, which gives an odds ratio of 2.7, which remains significant after adjustment for a variety of factors. Now, my colleague Robert Scragg published a year later an interaction between smoking and bed sharing. So again, we have a slightly different table. Here, the best group to be in is where mothers don't smoke and don't bed share, and this is our comparison group. If the mother smoked but didn't bed share, there was an increased risk, and it didn't matter whether we talked about behaviours in the last two weeks or the last sleep. It increased risk, both of which were statistically significant. If one looked at mothers that didn't smoke and didn't bed share, we got slightly different figures. If we looked at used bed sharing in the last 2 weeks, we had an increased risk, but if we used the last sleep, there was no increased risk. But when babies were exposed to both, in other words, the mothers smoked and the baby was bed sharing, there was an increased risk. Now, this interaction between maternal smoking and infant bed sharing has been confirmed now in many, many different studies. What about infants that are taken to bed for breastfeeding or for cuddles, but are returned to their own cot? Well, work from the UK initially showed convincingly that these infants are not at increased risk, providing the babies are returned to their own cot. And then this might explain why mothers that intend to place their infants back in their own cot but fall asleep for some reason are at higher rate. This might be because they're tired. And so one of the things which we've concluded, this provides really quite strong evidence that it's the bed sharing that's the issue, not just the characteristics of the mothers that bed share. The biggest increase, the European SIDS work led by Bob Carpenter and published in The Lancet in 2004 showed that there was an interaction with age. And this is about one of the most complex figures that I've seen, so I'll take you through it slowly. The odds ratio here is a log scale, so that's our comparison group 1, that's an odds ratio of 10, odds ratio of 100, and this is the age of the infant along here. And what Bob Carpenter did was divide the groups up into smokers and non-smokers and looked at the risk of bed sharing. And so you can see that the smokers are much higher any age you look at is much higher for smokers. But there's also this age effect, so that the risk is highest in the very young. So for the ones that are under 4 weeks of age and you're a smoker, you've almost got an odds ratio of 30. And this gradually decreases, and by 6 months of age, it's still almost tenfold increased risk. For non-smokers, there is a small increased risk. For the young infants, about 2.5 here, and it becomes non-significant at around about 12 weeks. So what we can conclude here is that there is a risk of SIDS with bed sharing, and that's high when the mother smokes. There's a small increased risk when the mother does not smoke for infants less than 3 months. Bed sharing is associated with a longer duration of breastfeeding. Now, I haven't shown you that evidence, but that's fairly consistent from observational studies. And it might be that breastfeeding encourages bed sharing rather than the other way around. Bed sharing infants placed back in their cots are not at increased risk, and there is no evidence that bed sharing is protective against SIDS in any group. And so when there's an interaction present, removal of either factor will achieve the same effect. And although it's very desirable to stop smoking, those that can presented this way back in 1994. We said bed sharing is fine for cuddles and breastfeeding, but babies should be back in their own bed. When in the UK in February 2004, the Department of Health advised the safest place for your baby to sleep is in a cot in your room for the first 6 months. And then in October 2005, the American Academy of Pediatrics stressed the hazard of adults sleeping with an infant in the same bed, and recommended that infants do not bed share during sleep. And I'm sure that Van Hout will be talking about this in more detail. Now, one of the things which we've struggled with in New Zealand is that there's been a push by some groups to increase bed sharing in order to promote breastfeeding. And also in New Zealand, we have some cultural groups that where bed sharing is a very common practice, and so the recommendation not to do the common practice is interpreted as an attack on their culture. And so it's resulted in a controversy, which means that many health professionals now do not even address the issue of bed sharing, even though it's one of our recommendations. Now, we've been undertaking a number of surveys, and in each of these surveys of infant care practices, we know that less than 50% of parents even recognise that bed sharing is a risk. And what we've been arguing in New Zealand is that whatever one's stance on the debate, whether you're pro-bed sharing or anti-bed sharing, then parents at least have the right to know what the risks are, rather than just to ignore it. Okay, now I want to just talk about postulated mechanisms and what epidemiology might give us clues. I think that the major postulated mechanisms nowadays are airway obstruction, potentially rebreathing of expired gases, thermal stress, which has been led by Peter Fleming, infection, particularly by Carolyn Blackwell. The apnea hypothesis was the major one, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but is certainly less so. There's probably a small number of deaths due to cardiac arrhythmias, particularly long QT syndrome, and the poisoning, particularly by immunisation, which has been stressed by some anti-immunisation groups, is clearly not true and can be ignored. Now, one of the striking changes with the Back to Sleep campaign was the change in the winter distribution. So this is data from New Zealand. And so one of the things which you can see, this is each year, and this is the month. So this is our winter, in July, August. Very striking peak each winter. And then when we launched our campaign, almost overnight, that winter peak disappeared. And as you can see, by 1993, there's really no peak whatsoever. So that was totally unexpected. So we went back and looked at our New Zealand cot death study to try and see if we could see an explanation for this. And so what we ended up doing was dividing the year into the 4 seasons and then looking within that season. So it's like if we just did the study in the summer, we would find that sleeping position, prone sleeping position had an odds ratio of 2.1. If we'd only done the study in winter, we would have found that prone sleeping position had an odds ratio of 5. And if we looked in the fall or spring, it was around about 4. And so that provides some clue why the biggest reduction occurred in winter rather than summer. Now this is a map of New Zealand, and this was before the prevention program. So I live up here in Auckland, and this is our mortality rate prior to the campaign. And so up at the top of the north, which is obviously the north is closest to the equator, it's warmer. We had rates just under 3 per thousand. Here is around about 3, 4, 5, 6 per thousand. So a very striking north-south gradient. The other thing which happened when we launched our campaign was that north-south gradient just disappeared immediately. So again, we went back to our study and we said, well, if we'd just done the study in the North Island, what would the risk of prone sleeping, removing prone sleeping position had a big effect in the South Island than it did in the North Island. Now, Anne-Louise Ponsonby was probably the first one to describe this, but this is from our data, and it shows very similar findings. So TOG value is a measure of thermal insulation. So a duvet is equivalent to about 10 TOGs in general. So what we looked at, this category here says this is the amount of bedding and clothing, and it's just about right. It's not too little, it's not too much for the environmental temperature. And so prone sleeping position there had an odds ratio of 2.5. For those that had what we thought was probably too little clothing, it was 2.8. And those that had an excess of bedding, so those that were under 2 layers of duvets or more sometimes, had even a higher risk from prone sleeping position. We also looked at illness, and so we divided people up into those that had no illness, needed some advice, and then a very small number of infants that we felt that needed to be seen and possibly admitted, and within those groups we looked at the risk of prone sleeping position. And so you can see these are relatively low, but if the baby's unwell and got a temperature, then prone sleeping position is much more risky. So what we saw was the effect of prone sleeping position is modified by season, by latitude, by illness, by excess thermal insulation. And so we've concluded that the mechanism by which prone sleeping position is associated with SIDS is in some way related to temperature. Now, one of the things which, I'm now going to show you some unpublished data, but this, we tried to sort of think, how could we prove it rather than just show it? So we made some predictions. We thought, well, what's the country with the biggest number of areas? Well, obviously the United States, and you can. This was 12th of October, and this is in Fahrenheit, and you can see that the temperature up here is quite low, and as you go south to the equator, it increases. Around the edges, by the sea, you get an effect of modification of the temperatures, so you have to be a bit more careful about those areas on the two seaboards. but that's quite striking north-south. And so one of the things which we predicted was that the SIDS rate should be higher up here than down here. And we also felt, well, because the country has the Rockies here, that altitude might also influence the rates. Because the higher you go, the colder it is. And so temperature drops by, we use centigrade here, don't we? So 0.7 degrees centigrade per degree. 1 degree is defined by 6 nautical miles, or 111 kilometers. And altitude drops by, the temperature drops by 6.5 degrees centigrade for every 1,000 meters you go higher. So this is the effect of altitude and the SIDS mortality rate for each county. And we just took the biggest city as being representative of the country. So here we have Alaska over here, and that would be Hawaii, and that big one I think is California. But you can see that there is a very significant gradient, that the more north you go, the higher the risk of SIDS. With altitude, the effect's not quite so dramatic, but again, there is a very significant relationship here. Big cluster of things there, but you can see it's sort of clearly going up there. And so we did see an increase, the effect of altitude and latitude, with an increased risk of SIDS. And interestingly, after the Back to Sleep campaign, we've looked at this again, and the effect of this risk has diminished quite dramatically. And although it's not eliminated, it's still markedly down. And we wonder whether this is because in the US it hasn't completely eliminated prone sleeping position as we've seen in New Zealand. So it really does look like prone sleeping position is operating in some way through a temperature mechanism. Now, what about infection? Ruth Gilbert, who was at the time working with Peter Fleming, showed that symptoms were very common in both cases and controls. And so increased risk in the last 2 weeks, 78% of cases reported some, or parents reported some symptoms, but 50% of controls also reported some symptoms. And in the last 24 hours, the risk had gone up more, so only 13% of controls and 44% of cases, an odds ratio of 5. When we looked at it at our study, we actually had real difficulty seeing any difference. So like cough in the last 2 days was very similar for cases and controls. Runny nose was similar for cases and controls. But when we did look at severity of the illness, there was an increased risk for those that looked like they needed to be seen by a medical practitioner. Although we're talking about very small numbers, only 2% of controls and 6% of cases, but it was a significantly increased risk. Now, one of the striking features of SIDS epidemiology is the age distribution, and I don't know of any other disease that follows this age distribution pattern, you know, with a lowish rate, now about 20-25% in the first month of life, peaking and then tailing off quite quickly. But one of the things which has always been striking is if you look at the infant's IgG level, it's almost a mirror image. This is what I've put in the green is what passively acquired IgG, and this is the infant's own production of IgG, and that's the serum level. And you can see it's a sort of mirror image. If you flip it, the peak is when the infant's IgG is at the lowest level. Now, what about, we know that a lot of the deaths, and in fact, in New Zealand, we've said that found that 2/3 of the deaths seem to occur during the night between 10 p.m. and 7:30 in the morning. This might, of course, be reflecting that the infants are asleep at that time, but it does appear that nighttime increases the risk of SIDS. So we went back to our New Zealand database and divided the study up into two groups, into those of the cases that died during the night and those that died during the day, and then looked at the infant care practices for both times. So if you look here, prone sleeping position is much more risky during the day. Breastfeeding doesn't make any difference here, there's no interaction. Maternal smoking is more risky at night. Bed sharing is more risky at night. Single mothers are more risky at night. MARI are more risky at night. And illness seems to be more risky at night. Maori are our indigenous people. They were the people that discovered New Zealand just about 1,200 years ago. The European that inhabited New Zealand were much more recent migrants to the country. So night deaths are associated with illness, maternal smoking, socioeconomic factors, bed sharing, and prone sleeping position, but at a lower odds ratio. And the deaths during the day seem to be prone sleeping position. We need any time? Okay. Now, Caroline Blackwell has postulated that some SIDS deaths are due to uncontrolled inflammatory reaction to infectious agents, particularly pyrogenic toxins of Staph aureus. And she postulated that in the prone sleeping position, there's pooling of the nasal secretions and increasing bacterial colonization, particularly when an infant has an upper respiratory tract infection. In fact, carriage rates are really high. 69% of normal healthy infants carry Staph aureus that's able to produce these toxins. But they only produce the toxins when the temperature is between 17 and 40 degrees. And this temperature is normally below this level, except for when the baby's prone or has a viral infection, which increases the nasopharynx. Now, the development of the adult circadian rhythm pattern, which is characterized by the drop in body temperature, develops suddenly around about 12 weeks of age. And this is associated with a sharp drop in nighttime levels of cortisol. Now, high cortisol decreases the pro-inflammatory cytokines, whereas low levels don't. And so at night, infants that are not protected by passively acquired maternal antibodies or by the development of their own active immunity may be particularly vulnerable to infectious agents. During the day, the higher cortisol levels reduce production of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, and thus infants are not at risk from SIDS, from an infective mechanisms. What about rebreathing of expired gases? Well, that would result in hypoxia and hypercarbia. I think it's quite convincing mechanism for death for infants found prone on polystyrene pillows, where you can get quite marked rebreathing. Similarly, deaths of infants found between the edge of the mattress and cot sides have been attributed to wedging, and that might be through this mechanism. And I would postulate that these deaths would not be expected to show a circadian rhythm, but this has not been examined. So the mechanism of SIDS, from the evidence from epidemiology, suggests that prone sleeping position involves some thermal mechanism. The infection inflammatory mechanism would only appear to operate at night. Rebreathing of expired gases certainly occur in a small proportion of cases. And long QT syndrome may explain a very small number in SIDS cases. So I think that epidemiological databases, both old and new, should be examined to clarify these associations. And I think for the physiologists amongst us, they need to determine whether there is a circadian variation in response. My final conclusion is that I really believe that SIDS is preventable. We've demonstrated with prone sleeping position that we can markedly reduce the risk. If we concentrate on the other risk factors, then there are very few deaths now that do not have the presence of smoking or bed sharing, at least in our population. And I think if we apply what we currently know, we could eliminate SIDS. And the real challenge now is to find ways to implement that knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ed. And I open it for 5 minutes for questions because we are getting a little late. Any questions?
Thank you for your wonderful talk. Could you address something about the risk of premature infants?
It's hard to actually know exactly what the mechanism is there. They are certainly at increased risk, and the risk is also related to being born with low birth weight. So both prematurity and low birth weight increase the risk. Now, it's interesting that both Peter Fleming's group and our group looked at divided our studies up, for example, looking at at premature births for both cases and controls and full-term babies, cases and controls. And we actually didn't find any really significant interactions. And so the risks that we use for our normal population apply equally to the neonatal unit and the PREMs and the low birth weight ones. Interestingly, we both ended up having a different conclusion. In Peter Fleming's group, he concluded that this made a very useful targeted group because about 10 to 15% of deaths are occurring in this group, and therefore it provides a group that you can target. We actually concluded that we shouldn't specifically target them because the messages were exactly the same, and therefore they should receive the same information.
You mentioned in your opening statement about pacifier use, and I don't see you went into that. Pacifiers. Yeah.
This is another example of where you can take the same data and come to two different conclusions. Fern wrote a very nice meta-analysis for the American Academy of Pediatrics, and there is no doubt that there are 8 studies or more now that have looked at pacifier, and basically pacifiers halve the risk of infant death. And Pete Blair and myself and Monique Leher from the Netherlands also looked at the same data, made the same conclusion, and there is no doubt that there is an association with pacifier use reducing the risk by about 50%. The question is what you do about it. In the US, there is recommendations to use a pacifier after breastfeeding has been established. We concluded that the evidence wasn't, we were concerned about what the mechanism might be that it produces the risk. After all, pacifiers don't stay in very long. It's hard to actually imagine that it's to do with the pacifier being present all the time, because you know, something like 50% of pacifiers fall out within 20 minutes. 100% have fallen out within an hour of falling asleep. So it's only covering a very small amount of sleep. And so it's hard to work out what's going on. And what we were concerned about was the effect of pacifiers on breastfeeding. And so our conclusion differed from the American Academy. What we said is that pacifiers should no longer be discouraged, but not specifically recommended. Maybe we're sitting on the fence. We're not making a decision one way or the other.
Any questions? I want to thank you so much and for your challenging mechanism explaining how it is connected to epidemiology. Maybe we'll know better next year. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
אנחנו ממשיכים בסשן הבא. אני מזמינה את יושב ראש הסשן דוקטור פיקר ואת המשתתפים.
כן.